We left off on Friday where all the philosophers had difficulty relating to the concept how when you do a mundane act, which is material, and somehow this activates or creates a spiritual entity where there's nothing spiritual about the physicality of the action. We speak about the physical world as finite. If there is a spiritual world and it's infinite, how could finite create infinite? How does it work? Therefore, they rejected the whole concept. It's not possible. Everything has its limitation, and because of that limitation, it's locked into that, whatever the capacity is. There's a Maral of Prague, or Chaim HaKodesh also. We know that one of the greatest Torah sages of the Talmudic period, or the Mishnaic period, was Rabbi Akiva. He was one of the 10 martyrs that was killed by the Romans. And very often, he would enter into public debate with the Roman governor, who ultimately put him to death. And he posed the question to the Roman governor, who was a pagan, whose action is more perfect? Whose accomplishment is more perfect? God's or man's? So the Roman governor understood if Rabbi Akiva is posing that question, it's evident that it's coming from a basis where a person believes that there's this monotheistic being who's all-encompassing. He says, of course, God's action is more perfect. He says, I disagree with you. He was like taken aback. He says, how's it possible? Could man create heaven and earth? So Rabbi Akiva says to him, we're not speaking something which is beyond the capacity of a human being. Something that's within the ability of a human being, that particular area, is it more perfect than God's or not? That's what I'm speaking about. He says, of course, God's accomplishment, action is more perfect. He says, I disagree. He says, I'll show it, I'll prove it to you. He says, if you plant a seed and you have a kernel of wheat, which grows out of the ground. So you have the kernel. So the farmer, he harvests the wheat, threshes the wheat, extracts the kernel, he mills it, he turns it into dough and bakes it into bread. So whose final product is more perfect? God, which the final product is the kernel, the raw kernel, or is the loaf of bread, which is formed and fully developed into something which is healthier and tastier and more beautiful, more attractive. So you see that man's action is more perfect than God's. So he says, it's something that's been bothering me. This is the Roman governor speaking. He says, if God created man with a foreskin, why does the Jew go and do self-mutilation and remove the foreskin? He says, you don't understand. You don't understand what I'm speaking about. God created an imperfect world. That's the world God created. And the objective of man is to take that imperfect world and bring it to a level of perfection. Just as the kernel is not perfect. It's not fully edible. It's only fully edible and fully advantageous health-wise when it's fully developed by the human being. Identically, the human being is imperfect, and the objective of man is to perfect it, and therefore we remove the foreskin, which brings him to a perfect level. So the Chaim HaKodesh asks, who's a semi-Kabbalistic commentary on the Torah, asks, this Roman governor was a very intelligent man. Why wasn't the takeaway from the kernel to the loaf of bread obvious? And if it's so obvious and so illuminating, why do you ask the question? I really don't understand why the Jews circumcise themselves. It seems to be mutilation. But he just explained to you. Just as the kernel to the loaf of bread, the finished product is more perfect. Identically, God created the human being imperfect. And as a result of that, removing the foreskin brings him to a level of perfection. But for whatever reason, he didn't get it. Why didn't he get it? Why didn't he get it? So he explains the concept of spirituality, to be able to internalize it and have relevance to appreciate that, a non-Jew has doesn't have the capacity. Why? Meaning the kernel to the finished loaf of bread, that's a reality. It's a reality. The kernel is barely edible, but when it's fully processed, it's more than edible. It's even desirable to eat. Bread is the staple of life. But a human being who's born uncircumcised, evidently that's the way he's supposed to be. How, if you take off the foreskin, how does that somehow perfect the human being? How does that do it? In reality, because now that you've removed the foreskin, now you're more perfect. But evidently, if he's born that way and he fully functions because he himself was a pagan, was uncircumcised, how by removing that are you more perfect? But he didn't understand that there's a spiritual counterpart to the human being. In terms of the physical, he understood it fully. You take it from the base level to the more perfected level. But when you take the human being who's seemingly fully developed, and we don't see the value of removing the foreskin, it only lessens him, minimizes him. So how does that make him more perfect? The answer is because he doesn't have any grasp or any relevance to understand what the spiritual realm is. That there's such a thing, concept known as evil. And there's such a thing known as positive forces and nether forces. He has no relevance to that. Reb Kiva tried to explain it to him, but even after everything's said and done, he didn't get it. Therefore, although he had the most exact equivalent, to him it wasn't equivalent. Now, what is that? So we mentioned many times, we mentioned the Zohar. When Adam was created, he was created nearly perfect. For instance, he was at a point of 99.9999. How would he bring himself up to the 100% point? His challenge was not to eat of the tree of knowledge. If he wouldn't have eaten of the tree of knowledge, he would have risen to the 100% mark, achieved perfection. And if he would have, he'd be eternal forever. There'd be no evil in the world. The evil of the tree of knowledge, even that evil, would be expunged from existence, wouldn't exist, because that evil of the tree of knowledge only existed as the challenge to Adam. Does he eat of the tree of knowledge? Does he not eat of the tree of knowledge? But if he met that challenge and did not, and he achieved perfection, there's no need for that any longer. Now the world is perfect. That evil will be purged, expunged from the world, and the world is a perfect world. Adam lives perfectly in his perfect state, and he fully cleaves to God. As God is perfect in the absolute sense, he, within the human context, has a semblance of that. Therefore, he's able to cleave fully to Hashem. But unfortunately, he didn't. He ate of the tree of knowledge. What happened when he ate of the tree of knowledge? And he ingested, and he allowed that evil to intermingle and become essential in his being. Now he has evil as part of his makeup. What does evil do? Evil, as we mentioned, is what? Why did God create evil? God created evil that you should not do evil. Every life is a challenge. If you don't have the alternative choice, it's not a choice. If all the choice is only positive, so what's the challenge? The challenge is, do you gravitate to what you're inclined to? When God destroyed the world with the great flood, God made a covenant with existence. I will never bring a great flood upon the world again, because man's inclined to evil from the moment he's cast from his mother's womb. That's a reality. Therefore, being that reality, God says, man is just going to become a repeated offender. And unless I make a covenant with existence, which brings the level of mercy to that level, the world's not going to continue, just going to repeat itself. But man, why is man inclined to evil? Why? For the same reason why he has that foreskin. The foreskin is an expression of that evil of the ingestion of the tree of knowledge. Because what is evil? Is if a person clearly understands and sees a fire raging before him, is he going to walk into the fire? Knowing that he's going to destroy himself? Definitely not. Evil is able, like an addict, a person who's addicted, when he begins craving, he loses his rational perception of things. And he believes that's something which is advantageous and beneficial to him, he loses clarity. Evil causes a person to lose clarity. And if you lose, so what the concept of losing clarity is, it's a cover-up. Things are concealed. Things are distorted. Things are no longer clear. What is the foreskin? The foreskin, initially, when Adam was created, there was no covering. On the reproductive organ, there was no covering. It expressed itself in that location. The foreskin covered it up. Now, what's the most overwhelming force in a human being in terms of sin? The sexual drive. That's the most overwhelming drive within a human being. Until Adam of the tree of knowledge, God, after they eat, they hear some rustling in the Garden of Eden, and they realize it's God's presence. And they immediately, Adam and Eve, they hide themselves. So God says to them, where are you? They said, we're hiding because we're ashamed because we're naked. So he says, how do you know you're naked? Why all of a sudden now nakedness, being unclothed, resonates in a way where it causes shame? Because now that representation of the physicality of human being has relevance to sin. Until then, they were pure. Being pure, a pure baby, a newborn baby, there's no shame. Being in a naked state. It's only when you're able to engage in that act, the question, that act itself, if it's done with absolute purity, it's not a problem. But that act cannot be done with purity under any circumstance. Even if you do it for the sake of God, you have to have that desire, and only that desire allows the person to be able to procreate. Without that desire for the woman, the man cannot procreate. It will not happen. The woman is only the recipient of that. But in terms of the man, in terms of fertilizing the sperm and creating the motility in the sperm that comes out of him, that can't happen unless he has that desire. Before Adam ate of the tree of knowledge, it was a natural act. You have to procreate, you have it in your mind. It's like a person that has hunger, you eat, and that's it. It's not, you crave that. There's no craving. All there is only spirituality. But now that you ingested the evil, all of a sudden now it takes on, you're inclined, you're drawn to that. So where is the covering? The covering is exactly on that organ, which is the sexual organ. God gave the Jewish people a positive commandment. It's called circumcision. And the circumcision is referred to as Bris Kodesh. It's the Holy Covenant. The Holy Covenant. And it was given to Avram Avinu, Abraham, the founding patriarch of the Jewish people, because he achieved a certain level of spiritual perfection, despite the fact that he was uncircumcised. He recognized God through his own quest for truth. He espoused God's presence. He was willing to die for God. And he reached a level of spiritual perfection despite his handicap. God said, now we're ready to address your handicap. You and your children will maintain the holy covenant called the circumcision. By removing that foreskin, although you're naturally born with it, which is an indication that you have traces of that evil within you, but that will be able to curb it, to take control of that evil. That evil is not going to hoodwink you continuously, which makes it almost impossible. The challenge is like overwhelming. But now that you remove it, that will curb the sexual drive, and that will give you open all kinds of horizons to spiritual opportunity, which you don't have until that's removed. And therefore, what is the liability for not circumcising oneself when one becomes an adult? The liability is spiritual excision. Every other positive commandment, we only find spiritual excision regarding negative commandments. A person that eats on Yom Kippur carries a very serious liability. A person commits adultery, God forbid, or incest, it carries a very serious life. That's don't. But remaining passive and not removing the foreskin, you think it's like not saying the Shema. One doesn't say the Shema, or doesn't eat the matzah to Seder, it doesn't carry that level of liability. But if one doesn't circumcise himself as a Jew, the liability is spiritual excision. Why? The answer is because our only relevance to spirituality at the level that we're meant to be is only if that foreskin is removed. Because by removing that foreskin, we're addressing the evil which overtakes the human being, which causes to see negative as positive, positive as negative. So by removing it, that curbs that drive, the overwhelming drive that a human being has that drives the person, that you could take control of it. There's a beautiful Orach Chaim HaKodesh who writes, you would think, in Christianity, priests are celibate. They're celibate. Why? Because the only reason why a human being engages in sex, because that's original sin. It's something which is dirty. Something because the human being is tainted, therefore he has to engage in that act. But the priest, who's the represents holiness in their religion, he's celibate. But a Jew, it's based on the Midrash, a Jew has the ability to procreate and does not, he has a very serious liability. He deserves, between him and God, to be taken. Because God gives you the ability to demonstrate and act in a creative act similar to your maker. Because the human being was created in the image of God. And just as God is a creator, the closest thing to creation, ex nihilo, is the act when you fertilize that ovum. Nothing exists. And all of a sudden now it's fertilized. And within the gestation period, a human being develops from what? This colorless fluid to what? To the ovum. The Talmud discusses a case, Cleopatra. What impressed her, and she was taken aback by, she said to the rabbi, it's unbelievable. I see what God is able to do. It's not to be believed. What attracted her? You have this colorless fluid called sperm, fertilizes the ovum, and all of a sudden a human being develops from nothing. And you have various parts of the human body. You have the bone, you have the flesh, you have the skin, you have the hair, you have the eye, and you have the pupil, and you have the color and the texture. This is unbelievable. From nothing, all of a sudden, it's a creation. From nothing, you have something. So procreation, it's called procreation. This is the human being's partnership with God, as the Talmud tells us, the three partners in every human being. Adam and Eve were God's creation. When Chava had mothered her first child, she called him Cain. Why did she call him Cain? Cain. She says, because I acquired a human being together with God, a child with God. This is our partnership. Until then, there was no partnership. It was all God. God created the soul, created the body. Here, the body is who contributes to all the two aspects of the body? That's the father and mother. God contributes the soul. That's the partnership. That's the threesome. So we ourselves, we provide the physicality for the soul to be infused into the body to create this composite, which is the functional human being, to be in a state of challenge between the physical and the spiritual. That's the tug of war, which is from the first moment you're born till the moment you die. That's the reality of life. So therefore, if a person doesn't procreate, it's not only because that's the purpose of creation. Because procreation that's an expression of being created in God's image. That's what it is. The Talmud tells us, based on verse in prophets, Chizkiyahu, the king of Judah, who was a person who was qualified to be Moshiach, because he did not procreate, Yeshaya, the prophet, came to him and says, and he became deathly ill. He says, because you did not procreate, you will not come out of that sickbed and you're going to die. That's what he said to him. So he says, but how could I procreate? I see my divine vision that I'm going to have a son who's so evil and he's going to wreak such spiritual havoc on the Jewish people. I can't do it. So Yeshaya, the prophet, says to him, don't meddle in God's affairs. You do what you have to do. That child, what it'll be, that's up to God. That child has free choice, and that God allows him those parameters of choice. That's God's issue. That's not your issue. Say, he ended up marrying the daughter of Yeshaya. He says, we'll give it the best chance. He has the pedigree of Judah, of the Davidic line. Yeshaya was a Kohen and a prophet. We have the best things going from both sides. But yet he had Menashe. Menashe, the evil king, that was the son of Chizkiyahu, who was the king who was worthy to be Mashiach. But yet, because he didn't procreate, he was meant to die. And only because he changed and he prayed for recovery, therefore he lived and he was able to fulfill the obligation of procreation. But that's what it's about. So the Or HaChaim HaKadosh asks, if actually after the sin, even if we remove the foreskin, the Talmud tells us that something very interesting. Normally, when a person abstains, a person doesn't eat. With time, you become hungry. And if a person, let's say, conditions himself to have, even if he eats a pittance, ultimately, but he's still hungry, he feels he hasn't satisfied his need. But yet, when it comes to the sexual drive, the Talmud tells us there's one small organ in the human body. The more you satisfy it, the more it craves. And the more you deny it, the more sated it is. That's the sexual drive. A person who engages to a lesser degree has more control. A person who's out of control in that area, you'd say, years ago, they used to say, if a person wanted to stop smoking, you go cold turkey, it's just a question of a few days, you're back to smoking again. The person's addicted. So how do you do it? One day you smoke about 4 packs of cigarettes. And the person smokes to the point he can barely breathe. And after that, and he reeks from such a smell of tobacco smoke, nobody wants to go near him. His wife, his children, and even himself. And when he goes to a motel in those days, they didn't have smoking rooms, or no smoking rooms. They didn't even let him go through the front door. He was beyond that. After that, he stopped smoking. But when it comes to the sexual drive, the more you engage in it, you can't satisfy. That's how you become addicted. It's more and more. It just grows. When you deny, you deprive yourself, and it's within a level of a modicum of it, then you have control. But again, what is that? That's the overwhelming drive in the human being. So the sign of the covenant, where did God put the sign of the covenant? It's called the holy. It's Bris Kodesh, the holy sign of the covenant. Exactly on that organ. That means every child Jewish child that's conceived, it's touched by that covenant of the holy covenant. That sanctifies. The act becomes an act, although it's a sexual act, and it could only be activated through desire. But simultaneously, because it's within the context of a mitzvah, a procreation, and the sign of the covenant, holy, is there, that tempers and protects and gives a chance for the human being who fulfills the mitzvah of procreation, which is the first obligation to procreate, that the person should not be affected negatively by it. This is the Or HaChaim HaKadosh in one location in the Torah, because it's a reality. If it's a reality, so how does man goes out of control? If it's within the context of the mitzvah, it generates a holiness. And because it generates a holiness, that holiness protects the person, that he should not go off the cliff, as they say. He should be in a state of control, that he's able to control himself for that reason. And once mentioned the name of the Shalom Kodosh. The Shalom, he writes, he was a Kabbalist, he writes that a husband to a wife has a conjugal obligation. The conjugal obligations. However, there's certain times a person who is obligated, a Jew, to keep the laws of family purity, the night the wife goes to the mikveh that she's permitted, it's at the time when she's supposed to go, and she becomes permitted to husband, that night is a night that a person has a conjugal obligation to his wife. Not because he denied her that, or she was denied to him, therefore. It's it's a night. See, he explains why. The Talmud tells us there was a discussion, when does the soul go into the child? We know that life, from conception to life, is a 40-day period. Discussed it the other day. After 40 days, that's life. So when does the soul go into the child? At 40 days, or immediately at the time of conception, the soul goes in immediately. So Rabbi Yehuda Nossi, Judah the prince, had a special relationship with the Roman emperor. And there was a tunnel between the palace of the Roman emperor, his name was Antoninus, and Judah the prince. And in secrecy, he would go under this underground tunnel to the palace of Judah the prince, and he would study Torah with Rabbi Yehuda Nossi, and eventually converted. He become a Jew. Antoninus, the Roman emperor, and when he decided to become a Jew and he was converted, he fled because they would have killed him for becoming a Jew. But all this came about because he studied Torah with Rabbi Yehuda Nossi, with Judah the prince. So they had a question between them. Antoninus, the Roman emperor, says to Judah the prince, when does the soul enter into the child? Okay, he understood, he was taught that there is a spiritual component in the human being. When does that spiritual component, which is the essence of the human being, enter into the child? So Rabbi Yehuda Nossi says, Judah the prince says, after 40 days. When life begins, that's when the soul comes into the child. Antoninus had said, no, immediately at the time of conception, it has to. Why? What's the reason? Because if you have a piece of meat and you leave it, it becomes putrid because it doesn't have life in it. Something only remains healthy and intact and vibrant only if it has life in it. Once the life leaves it, it starts decomposing, deteriorating. Therefore, if at the time of conception, unless life is infused at that moment, how does it develop and evolve into life? It must be the soul is inserted, infused immediately. This is the Roman emperor's position, Antoninus. And it says that Rabbi Yehuda Nossi agreed, and he realized that what the Roman emperor is saying, Antoninus is more correct than what he says. It goes in immediately. Now, what determines what a human being is? What determines what the human being is the dimension of the soul. If it's going to be a male or a female, it's time of conception. In the Kabbalah, Kabbalistic writings, there is a female soul and there is a male soul. A woman has, although it's a spiritual makeup, and a Jew, a male or a female, we find that a woman's obligations are not the same obligations as a man, even within the context of Judaism. Because the mitzvos, the commandments which are given to us, negative commandments, there's no difference between the man and the woman. The positive commandments, we find the differences. Because the only reason why we're obligated to fulfill the commandments is only because the way we are able to perfect the various aspects of the soul is only through the mitzvos. Those are the spiritual infusions into the soul, which develop the soul to reach a level of completion and to have relevance to eternity. A woman doesn't have the same spiritual needs as a man. Therefore, her positive commandments are different than many are the same. Most are the same, but there are differences because she doesn't have those needs. The woman's needs are not the needs of a man. That's what it is. So he says, the soul comes into the child at the time of conception. Satan, in the worst way, he tries to foul it up, and almost at that moment, he tries to taint that soul. And by tainting the soul, he tries to minimize the potential of that soul. What about if that person, that couple, who are engaging in this act of procreation, they have divine protection at that moment? Satan is kept out the door. Can't go near that soul that's going to be infused, the life which is going into that child. So the Shalom Kodesh writes that because these two people, naturally, the man is attracted to the woman's attracted to the man. And despite that, they suppress that desire, that temptation for the sake of God, because God says you must live within the context of family purity, and you're not permitted to engage. So measure for measure, as you kept your desire at bay and did not succumb to it, identically, I will keep the evil inclination at bay. I will not allow him to come to any degree to affect the status of that soul, so that soul should be able to have its full potential of spirituality. And therefore, that's why there's a conjugal obligation the night of the mikveh, because this is the first moment that the woman now, due to purifying herself, meeting the standards and the criteria of the Torah family purity, at this moment, she's permitted to husband. And until that, humanly, they could have engaged with one another, but they did not. So because of that, that's the reason why the couple merits this divine protection. So, and that as a result of that, that child that will, if there is conception, that soul will be a special soul, untainted, protected by God himself. Identically, the whole idea of the foreskin is a covering. When something is covered, that means it indicates it's a lack of clarity. It's concealed. God says you could remove it. At the 8th day, a male child, you remove that foreskin. Although we're still human, we have all the handicaps of that tree of knowledge, but it's not to the same degree. We've tempered it. It's within the context of control. And because it's within the context of control, the level and the parameters of choice of a Jew are much greater than a non-Jew. A non-Jew, because of his handicap, he has no positive commandments, and his negative commandments are limited to a very few. A Jew has endless negative commandments, many nuances, because it's a different reality. We have a different reality. Our spirituality is a different reality. But that reality we're talking about now, it's not something, you could figure it out in the laboratory. You put it on the microscope. Spirituality is something which you have to have relevance to. Otherwise, I'll give you an example. A person was blind from the time of birth. You cannot describe what light is to that person, no matter what. The frame of reference of light has no relevance to a human being because the person never saw in his life. The person was able to see, and God forbid lost his ability to see because he understood, at one time he experienced light and what illumination meant, so he has relevance to understanding what that is. But a person who was never touched by that, but that's not part of the person's frame of reference, they have no relevance to that whatsoever. The Jew has relevance to that. So when Rabbi Akiva explained to the Roman governor that the objective of man is to perfect himself, and we were created in imperfect state, which is the foreskin, because man was created without that foreskin initially. As we mentioned, the Midrash tells us that Adam, before he ingested of that tree of knowledge, he was able to see from one end of the world to the other. That was his level of clarity. The moment he ate of that tree of knowledge, that foreskin developed. He was no longer able to see. He didn't have that level of clarity. He was minimized. But representation of that minimization is that foreskin. Avraham Avinu was the founding father of Jewish people. We were reinstated. We were chosen to take on the position of Odom. Atem Kruim Odom. You are the Adam. Adam was disenfranchised. Now you have that. But even to be able to relate to that, to have relevance to that, to appreciate that, you have to be a Jew. Otherwise, if you're not a Jew, you have no relevance. So when Rabbi Akiva had given the equivalent case of the kernel versus the complete baked bread, it's the same thing. He says, I don't understand. What's imperfect if you have a foreskin? Why is that imperfection? If you're born with it, if that's the way you're supposed to be. Because it's only if you're a Jew do you realize the difference being circumcised and uncircumcised. A Jew, until that foreskin is removed, he has no relevance. That's a barrier. That's an impediment to spiritual growth, as I said. And that's the reason why the father has an obligation on the 8th day to remove that foreskin. For that reason, child is not capable. but that's the father's responsibility. As the father brought him into existence, the father's responsible to open all the streams of spirituality by removing that impediment, which is a basic impediment, to give him opportunity to begin developing from the 8th day onward, to be exposed to a spiritual environment, which is the upbringing, everything else. We've mentioned many times in the name of the Maharal of Prague, the significance of numbers. 7 always connotes the physical world. The process of creation was a 7-day process. 8 is always supernatural, because that's beyond the 7. When do you circumcise a child, a male child? On the 8th day. Naturally, that's what you are. That's the natural world. That's what Adam created through his failing. But once Avram was able to achieve, to go beyond the natural, he was able to recognize, which no one was able to recognize, that the world has a master. And he's the one who identified God as master, Adni. Therefore, he was chosen to be the replacement for Adam. That he will be the one who could go beyond those limitations. He's not limited, he's unlimited. Therefore, the circumcision is on the 8th day, not on the 7th day. For that reason, to connote this point, we reached our pinnacle of spirituality when we were taken as a Jewish people through the giving of the Torah. The Torah was given 50 days after we left Egypt. So again, the Maharal of Prague explains 50 is 7 multiples of 7, and it's 1 beyond that. That's 50. The Torah itself, tefillin, male puts on tefillin, leather boxes, parchments. They have to have a certain shape. They have to have a certain color. They have to be made of a certain type of leather. And all these various components and all these criteria have to be met. Otherwise, it's not tefillin. What's it all about? It's physical. Does it really make a difference if it's green, blue, or whatever it may be? You know, the Sadducees, that tefillin was not square or was not flat. Because the Sadducees, they rejected the oral law. And the oral law tells you exactly what tefillin is supposed to be, or many things are supposed to be. The Pharisees, which were the rabbis, our tradition is not only is the written law divine, even the oral law is divine. We understand it's something other than that. They said, no, as we say, seeing is believing. Seeing is believing. The Torah that's a text that's given. We know that was given. The oral law, we're not so sure. Maybe the rabbis, they concocted a whole story and they said that's what it means because they're trying to sell us a bill of goods. We know the Torah we have from Moshe, we know this is the original. We can actually authenticate it, but the oral law, it was never committed to writing. We really know what it was. The rabbis are trying to convince us, therefore they rejected it. But it's the same idea. Because something which is in the realm of spirituality, you can't relate. It's something beyond. It's something which has no limitation. And therefore, what is the obligation of the study of Torah, which is the ultimate illuminator? Being physical beings, how do we have relevance to the spiritual realm? All our senses are all within the context of what we feel and what we understand. All our frames of references, all our experiences are all within the context of physicality. How do you somehow supersede that? How do you transcend that? How do you have relevance to beyond that? God gave us the Torah. The Torah is a mechanism that when you study it and you, at various levels, as I said, it activates the senses of the soul. The soul has senses also. They're called spiritual senses. But the only way you could activate those spiritual senses, you have to have the spiritual code. The spiritual code is called the Torah. And when you study that, you start sensing it something. There was a story many years ago. A certain man, happily married, had a wife, totally secular Jews. And this man was a very successful, very intelligent man. He started studying with a rabbi. And he studied with him, and he was like enthralled. He had the finest education. He was intellect. He was brilliant. And all of a sudden he's studying this, something he was never exposed to. And he's being touched very seriously by it. And he says to the rabbi, we have to stop studying. So the rabbi says, why? I mean, you're so excited, you're so appreciative, and you see its value. He says, you know something? Right now, I'm married to my wife. I have children. I have a stable life. I'm happy in my life. If I take this route, I would come to realizations that what I believe is what it's about, it's not what it's about. I don't want to rock the boat. I don't want to divorce my wife because I don't believe she's coming with me. I want to have a relationship with my children. And if I take on this new level of behavior and existence, I'm going to alienate my children. Therefore, I'm stopping at this point. And he did not continue studying. What's it all about? You know, the answer is because if a person is truthful and you're touched by the Torah and it's communicated as it's supposed to be communicated, when you put your hand into hot water, you feel the heat because you have, if your senses function and if your eyes see, you see light. It's a reality. The Torah itself was given to us as the mechanism. Although we're physical beings, it somehow touches us in a way, it activates the essence of the person where the person realizes it's not the physical, it's not the food, it's not the pleasure. All these experiences are only to facilitate the spiritual person. But what's spiritual? What does a chocolate cake taste like? If you never taste anything which has any real, and you have functioning taste buds, you got to taste it to know what it is. Once you taste it, then you have an inkling of what it is. And then you make your decision whether you want to continue or not continue. It's identical. But especially as a spiritual being, the only spiritual mechanism which could touch us is only the Torah itself and doing the commandments and not violating the negative commandments. The Ramchal writes in the Path of the Just that when it comes to dietary laws, there are very many negative commandments, but one of the negative commandments are dietary laws. And we speak about, it's already spoken about in the species that went into the ark. There were the kosher species, non-kosher species. They're referred to as Behemah Torah, the pure species, and the contaminated species. Contaminated means they were contaminated within the context of spirituality. It contaminates the spirituality of the Jew. So the Ramchal writes, the Torah says the Torah speaks about ingesting non-kosher species or non-kosher food. In Hebrew, the word to be contaminated is, and you become contaminated, you become contaminated. If you ingest it, you become contaminated. The person says, what do you mean? I'm whistle clean. I maintain a level of hygiene. There's nobody who's the equivalent of I am. You know, there was no Dinkins when he was the mayor of New York. He used to take a shower 4 times a day. And he had somebody carrying another change of clothing with him because when he played tennis and this and that, what do you mean? I'm not clean. What do you mean? I'm contaminated. You know, and if I ate the non-kosher food, how does that contaminate me? What it means, the Torah says, Minit Meisimbom. It shuts down your spiritual systems. And Ramchal writes that of all negative commandments, what impacts on us most negatively is eating non-kosher food. Why? Because when you eat a non-kosher species, what is a human being? It's what we eat, what we ingest. That becomes part of our physicality. If the non-kosher species becomes part of our physicality, it shuts you down totally. The body itself is the facilitator of the spirituality. But if the body itself, I'll give you an example. A person's a genius, creative, but unfortunately, he became paraplegic. And before that, he was creative, and there was nothing he can't develop and create. But now that he's paralyzed, although his mind works, what is it? You need the body to facilitate the mind, the creativity of the mind. The body is the facilitator. But what happens if the body itself, the system is shut down? Because the non-kosher species, which represents impurity, the body becomes part of that same impurity. The purity of the soul cannot function within an impure environment, which is the body. Therefore, the Torah says, "V'nitmeisim bam," You become, and it deletes the aleph, is omitted to indicate you're shut down. So to be able to have a sense of spirituality, you have to have a certain capacity. If you don't have that capacity, you don't even know what we're talking about. And that was the dialogue between Rabbi Akiva and the Roman governor. He gave him an example what it is, but as they said, he didn't get it. It was beyond his realm of capacity even to appreciate what the words meant. You know, people ask me very often, when you meet a person and you have a sense that he'll be receptive and you want to influence him in Judaism, what do you teach him? Do you teach him the whole gamut? You know, we have 248 positive commandments, 365. So of course not. You know, as good as something is, if the person is not at the point where he has the capacity even to relate to it, you totally overwhelm the person. He suffocates under it. You actually snuffing him out. Whatever interest it is, the person immediately gives up before he starts. So you have to be able to evaluate him. First, they have a sense, what does he have relevance to? Of all the various mitzvahs, what do you think he has greater relevance to, which would attract his attention, which he would sense its value? And you start there. But because there is a concept known as mitzvah goreres mitzvah, that a mitzvah encourages, engenders another mitzvah, if he does that well, and he appreciates that, doing something right creates a positive energy. That positive energy will impress upon him to go to the next level, to desire something more. And actually, it grows, and it develops, and it evolves. And over time, you know, life is like a blink of an eye. A year, 2 years, 5 years pass. It's like it hasn't even begun, and it's already 5 years. And a person changes. A person doesn't even realize how quickly he changes. And it works. But why does it work? But that's only because you have a Jewish soul. If it would be a non-Jew, it would not be the same. You know, you put the wrong code into a computer, you're not going to be able to activate the computer. The Jewish soul has a code. It's called the Torah. That opens all the spiritual functions of the soul. And if you expose it to that, it's activated at a very special level. And especially if you show an interest. You know, a person is caught in quicksand. You can't pull yourself out of quicksand. You need an external force to pull you out, as I said, to yank you out, because you're being sucked down. There's a suction. If you're pulled out, the Talmud tells us, if you want to purify yourself, you will merit special divine assistance. God will pluck you out. He'll pull you out of that morass, of that spiritual abyss. He'll help you out. But you have to be sincere at some level. And even not so sincere. But like in today's day and age, for a person even to be curious, a serious, sincere curiosity in this area, there's so much you could imbibe at the worst level, where society's pushing the envelope to the nth degree. We're going to go back to this archaic provincial practice to be an ancient caveman. Who wants that? So despite that, you have an interest. You know what this is? That person is what? It's more than a needle in a haystack. This is something which is unbelievable. If the person wants to, God will do whatever he can to help that person to gain traction and an understanding and the value of what it is. And as you grow, you will see its profoundness and its value. And you have friends, they meet you and say, what happened to you? Is there something wrong with you? Maybe you should go, I have a therapist I recommend. I have a former psychologist. He'll give you a medication. He'll take you out of this craziness that you've what side of the bed did you wake up this morning? It seems to me you haven't slept in years. What have you taken lately? It's because where they have, like the Roman governor couldn't even fathom or grasp what Rabbi Akiva was talking about. It's like they were speaking two different languages. Identically, our society, unfortunately, they have no relevance. And even a Jew who has no relevance to it, because he doesn't have the merit to be able to appreciate its value, he also looks at it in the greatest level of disdain. What is they brainwashed you? What are they doing to you? There's a story in Israel. The person was a secular Jew. And really, he hated Judaism with a passion. And all of a sudden, the son was about 18 years old, maybe 17. So he wasn't a full adult. And he got involved with a movement, a kiruv, bringing Jews back to Judaism. One day he comes home and his father sees he's acting differently. Shabbos, he's not putting on the lights. He's not going over to the stove. And his father says, what happened? So the son says to the father, I think from now on, I'm observing the Shabbat. So the father says, what happened? He says, well, I met some people and they shared with me something of our background and it touched me and it resonates with me. And I think from now on, that's what I'm going to do. The father became infuriated. He went berserk. And he says, I want to meet that rabbi. You know why? Because I'm going to bring him up on charges and I'm going to lodge a complaint in the court to have him arrested for trying to influence a minor. He wasn't 18 years old yet. Okay? And he was livid. The father was livid. He wanted to eat this rabbi alive. The rabbi was somehow put this, it's like he fed his child drugs or something. So he goes to the court and he has to present himself. The judge wasn't a rabid, anti-religious, but he wanted to hear, how do you right to brainwash the child? So the rabbi says, I am no different. What I did is no different what your father did to his father. So he says to this Jew, your father, was he an observant Jew? He says, yes. Was he a devout Jew? Yes. So what did you do to your father? You went, turned your back on him, and you said, I'm not interested. So why is your son worse than what you did to your father? He said to you, I'm not interested in what you represent. I'm going back to where we come from. So why am I more guilty than you are? What you did to your father, that's what your son's doing to you. As you had a right, your son has a right. That was the end of the story. Ultimately, the father went back to his roots and became an observant Jew. Okay? But the only reason why, because he touched something within the father, because there's a deeply embedded conscience of a Jew that it's so covered over, it's so suppressed, people don't want to hear about it, and they fight it. But if you're confronted with the truth and you can't escape it, as they say, there's no wiggle room, then you're forced to embrace it. Not forced, because of your level of recognition, you want to embrace it because you realize it's the right thing to do.
Rabbi, can I ask a question?
1 second. Yes, Alan, ask the question.
Rabbi, when a Baal Tshuva makes a decision to try to go on the right path, and Sutton wants to try to interrupt that, whether it's learning or Shoma Mitzvos, whatever, where does the interaction between Sutton trying to prevent and Hashem trying to help that happen? How does that interaction work? Where does it start and stop? And what determines the success and the failure?
Terrific question. Really phenomenal question. Now, as I always say, a test is only a test if you're able to meet the challenge. If you can't meet the challenge, it's not a test. If you tell the person, I want you to lift 1,000 pounds to test your strength, it's not a test. It's not within his ability. So when God presents something to anyone, it's within his ability to meet that challenge. So if he fails, it's because he chose to fail, although he doesn't believe that. So whenever a person is challenged in any area, he has to know factually, persons, it's been beyond my capacity. It's not beyond your capacity. It's within your capacity. And very often we have setbacks because we didn't really fully appreciate who we are and what our ability was. But Hashem, at every step of the way, if you're worthy, he gives you the ability, and if you're more worthy, to recognize that you have the ability. and you'll fight that to the nth degree, and you're going to succeed. So everything is based on many things. As I say many times, anybody who's an observant Jew today, if he attributes it to himself, he's arrogant. He's arrogant. Any observant Jew today, so what about all the other Jews that are not observant, which is the vast majority? The answer is because we have what we call schusovos. We have merit from previous generations. We had certain antecedents, grandparents, other people in our families, and in their merit, because they sacrificed for Judaism, and we being their descendants, God therefore looks out for us. These other people, unfortunately, they don't have that merit, but it's not us. But even now that we have that opportunity, it has to be within the realm of reality. The challenge has to be a challenge that we can meet the challenge. As I always say, we have the 10th test of Avram. Avram couldn't have met the 10th test unless he went through the whole level from 1 to 2 to 2 to 3. Ultimately, he was able to meet the 10th test, which was most difficult. So when God challenges you, and Satan challenges you to have value, you have to be challenged at some level. But it's a challenge which you can meet that challenge. Because if it's beyond that your ability, then it's just an exercise of futility. So every person who's becoming a Baal Tshuva, he has to, up front, you give him a certain orientation, you tell him, look, there's a principle, all beginnings start with difficulty. Because Satan doesn't want to leave you out of his clutches. He doesn't want to release you from his clutches. So you really have to extricate yourself. And sometimes it's a little tough, especially if you don't have the background. But the rabbi says, whoever wants to influence us, I will help you. Come speak to me. Don't make a decision without first calling me. Because as I say many times, questions are turned into answers. Like I told you, I once just ended with a story. Many years ago, there was a person, Tom Steinberg. And he used to come to Yad Avram. And he asked me, one day he called me up, a secretary who worked in the company, I'm not going to mention who the employer was, could she come speak to me? And she was a woman in her 50s then, I had no idea what it was about, but she wants to speak about something personal. So she comes to me. I once told the story. And she says to me, her father's dying in California, in Los Angeles. And every weekend she flies to California to see her father. But she's very troubled because ultimately he has terminal cancer. He's going to die. And he told her that he wants to be cremated. And all his siblings have intern burial. And she knows it's the wrong thing. It's not the Jewish thing to be cremated. And it bothers her. How do I deal with my father to explain to him that it's not the Jewish thing? So I immediately played devil's advocate. And I said, and why isn't it the Jewish thing to be cremated? Maybe it is the Jewish thing. Just because his brothers were buried, internment ground, maybe it's okay. If your father wants to be cremated, let him be cremated. She says to me, because it's not spiritual. For the body to destroy the body through cremation, it's not the spiritual thing. So I said to her, what's spiritual? What is spiritual? What's not spiritual? I said, could you explain to me what spiritual is? She says, I write poetry. When I write poetry, it's an expression of my spirituality. This woman already underwent surgery for cancer. She's divorced. She's a 17-year-old boy who was uncircumcised, who doesn't want to know her. So I said that one asked question, you believe in God? Yes. I said, does it make sense that God put you on this earth, this forsaken earth, that you should write, your expression of spirituality is you should write poetry? And by the way, how much poetry did you write? She says about 40 hours worth of poetry. So I said, for 40 hours worth of poetry, which is spirituality, do you think it's worthwhile for what you've gone through in your life? The divorce, the cancer, and all the other travails. She says, evidently, that's not spirituality. And I said, you never published your poetry. She says, you know what spirituality is? That when I ride my back into the wind and I feel exhilarated, that's spirituality. I said, I don't think so. She says, when I sit on top of the mountain and look at the Pacific and see the sun setting below the horizon, I take on a whole different feeling. I said, that's not spirituality. And I explained to you why. So she says, what's spirituality? I said, spirituality. I said, you have to come to my classes, and then you'll understand what spirituality is. Until then, you're not going to know what spirituality is. Okay? So she agreed to come. And I said, if you want, I'll give you a list of books to purchase or to borrow. Read those books. You'll have a sense of what spirituality is. She goes back to her employer because she was his personal secretary. And the employer says, how did it go? She says, phenomenal. He says, what's going to be? She says, I'm going to start attending some of the classes. She says, I want to ask you a question. When you extended your hand to the rabbi, did he shake your hand? See, she says, no. She says, I told you he wouldn't shake your hand. I don't think you should go. And that was the end of the story. She never came. Whether the father was cremated, wasn't he? I have no idea. You understand? Here she had an opportunity, and even to have a son maybe circumcised at the age of 17, which he was not. It's not simple. Her employer was a very phenomenally wealthy family. But why didn't he shake your hand? Could you really rely on this man's advice? Could he direct you? Could he give you any clarity on what life's all about? If he doesn't have the decency to shake your hand. But he explained it to me, He's a rabbi who doesn't shake women's hands. Doesn't make a difference. So these are all the challenges of Satan. We're going to end here. To be continued. Daf Yomi is at